We're going to talk about circulation and respiration together because these two systems are have functions that are very closely tied to each other. Here's the big problem when you're talking about animals that are, more than a handful of cells. Diffusion only works in a biological sense over microscopic distances, maybe a couple of cell diameters. If the distance is more than that, diffusion is still happening, but it's happening so slowly that it's not fast enough to do a living organism any good. So for small organisms, they don't have this problem. The whole cell surface is exposed to the environment, and even something that's a relatively large animal like a sponge is permeated with holes, so seawater is essentially in direct contact with every cell in that animal. So it doesn't need a circulatory system to move materials around the animal's body. Larger animals have to have that transport system, and it's really there to reduce the diffusion distance to, less than a couple of cell diameters. And as long as you can do that, diffusion is happening fast enough that it really works. A circulatory system by itself doesn't do everything you need it to do, because that's just the transport system. You still need to overcome the problems with having a really small surface to volume ratio if you're a large animal. And so to do that, you need some kind of specialized organs that overcome that limited surface to volume ratio, and usually that's by having a lot of surface area folded up internally somehow. So the function of the circulatory system is really to reduce the diffusion distance to the point where diffusion is still working fast enough to keep the organism alive. We've already talked a little bit about gastrovascular cavities. And so in this situation, you've got the gastric system and the vascular system intertwined. They are the same system. And basically, it works great as long as your body wall is only 2 cells thick, because then, that's a small enough distance that you have diffusion working fast enough to keep the animal alive. So you don't really need to worry about a very sophisticated circulatory system with a body plan like this. The problem comes in when the animal starts to become many cells thick, and at that point you need something that's a much more sophisticated transport system. So you've got to have some kind of circulatory system, and we can divide up these circulatory systems into 2 major categories: open systems and closed systems. In an open circulatory system, the blood is sometimes just sloshing around inside the body. It's not necessarily in a blood vessel. It is sometimes, but not always. And you can see in that grasshopper, you can kind of see how that system works. With a closed circulatory system, the blood is always in a blood vessel. It's moved around. It's in literally a closed system. And if the system breaks open, there's problems, right? Something has to heal to be able to repair it. So the two systems have some characteristics that are really different from one another. For one thing, in an open circulatory system, you need to have a lot of blood. And if you, because it's just sloshing around in the body, the open system is in some ways not very efficient. The heart moves blood in an open circulatory system, but the blood is also moved by movements of the body, which kind of makes sense, right? If the blood is not always in a blood vessel, it can't be just the heart that's making it move. There are no capillaries in an open system. The blood is bathing the organs directly. So arthropods have this system. Most mollusks have this system, although not the most sophisticated mollusks that are out there. With a closed system, you need a lot less blood, so only 5 to 10% of the body volume versus 20 to 40% of the body volume for an open circulatory system. The heart is mostly what's moving the blood, although body movements are assisting it, but it's mostly the muscle contractions of the heart. The blood is always confined to blood vessels. There are capillaries, and capillaries are the tiny blood vessels, incredibly thin-walled, that are the site where diffusion happens between the blood and the cells that are outside the circulatory system. So annelid worms have a closed system, the chordates do, and cephalopod mollusks have a closed system. All right, so let's talk about the components of a cardiovascular system, and we're really going to, since we're already talking about vertebrates, we're going to really be talking about a closed system. So in a cardiovascular system, you've got to have heart, blood vessels, and blood. In a heart, there are two different kinds of chambers. There is one or more atria. The atrium, an atrium is a chamber that receives blood that's returning to the heart, and it's part of the heart. It contracts, so it's pumping, but all it's doing is pumping blood into the major pumping part of the heart. So it's pumping blood a very short distance just from one chamber to another. The ventricles are the major pumping part of the heart, and this is where the muscle walls are really thick on the heart. The atria, when they contract, they fill up the ventricles, and then when the ventricles contract, that's sending blood out of the heart and out into the circulatory system. And then when it comes to blood vessels, we've got three different major categories of blood vessels. You've got arteries. Arteries are always blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Capillaries are the really tiny, microscopically small blood vessels where diffusion happens between the blood and the interstitial fluid, which is what's allowing materials to get in and out of the cells that are outside the circulatory system. So capillaries are so small that generally red blood cells have to squeeze through one at a time, single file. They're really tiny. And then once the blood has passed through capillaries, the name changes as the blood vessels start joining together and becoming larger and larger again. Once you're on the downstream side of a capillary bed, you are in a vein. Veins are carrying blood towards the heart. So the name changes at the heart. That's where you go from a vein through the heart, and when you leave the heart, now you're in an artery. And the name also changes once you pass through capillaries. So the blood's in an artery, then when it goes through capillaries and comes out the other side, now it's in a vein. So the name of the blood vessel changes at the heart and at the capillary beds. So we're going to walk through some of the basic circulatory systems that you find in vertebrates. The fish system is a nice basic system. Remember, fish generally don't have very high metabolic rates, and so they don't have to be able to oxygenate their tissues as efficiently as a mammal would, for instance. So fish have a single circuit circulation, and if you look at this, you can see that the heart is made of one atrium and one ventricle, and then there's a one-way valve between them. Those are called atrioventricular valves, and there's just one right there, or AV valves. And they are one-way valves, so the blood can only flow through the heart in the correct direction from atrium towards the ventricle. So we call this a two-chambered heart, one atrium, one ventricle. Here's the problem with this system, though. And actually, before we talk about that, let me just give you the breakdown on the color coding. When you see blue blood in these diagrams, that blood is low on oxygen. When you see red blood in these diagrams, that blood is well oxygenated. So hemoglobin does turn redder when it's oxygenated. So you wouldn't see the colors quite like this, but you get the idea. So it's color coded. The color coding is based on the oxygenation of the blood. So in a fish heart, as blood is leaving the heart, it's in an artery because we just left the heart. It's deoxygenated blood. It goes out into capillaries in the gills. So this is where we are getting rid of the carbon dioxide that's in the blood and picking up oxygen from the water. And of course, that's why the blood is changing color as it passes through those gill capillaries. And once we're on the other side of the gill capillaries, now the blood's red because it's oxygenated. Now it isn't labeled on this diagram, but this blood vessel, once we leave the gills, this is a vein. Because remember, we just passed through when we left the heart, we were in an artery, but now we've passed through a set of capillaries and come out the other side. So now we're in a vein. that carries blood out to all the capillaries in the body. So wherever you see systemic, though, that's just everywhere else in the body. So out in the body, the oxygen is used, so the blood turns from red back to blue. And here, this is labeled a vein, which is true. So we actually went from a vein over here to a vein over here because we went through two sets of capillaries, and then we go back to the heart. And when we remember, blood that's entering the heart always enters into an atrium. Blood that's getting forced out of the heart is always leaving the heart from a ventricle and being forced out into an artery. So this is what we would call a portal system, and I think we mentioned that in the talking about the digestive system, because we've got blood going through one set of capillaries, coming out the other side, and then going through another set of capillaries. That's a portal system, and they're very unusual in mammals. You don't have much in the way of portal systems, but in fish, it's the major feature of their circulatory system. So this is a relatively low pressure system, and the reason for that is that when you force the pressure of the blood is coming from the contraction of the ventricle. That's giving the blood its pressure, obviously, and that's what's making it move through this system. What you can't really tell when you look at these kind of cartoon diagrams is the incredible number of capillaries there are in a capillary bed. So to force that blood through just hundreds or thousands of kilometers of capillaries uses up pretty much all the blood pressure. So if you were going to measure the blood pressure over here in this artery where the blood has just left the heart, it would be pretty high. If you measure the blood pressure over here after that same blood has gone through the capillaries and the gills, it's going to be really low. It won't be quite zero, but it'll be getting close to that. And so, of course, if it's that pressure that's forcing the blood through the system, well, we just used up almost all the pressure getting through the first set of capillaries. So how does the blood get through the next set of capillaries? Well, there's two things that allows that to happen. First of all, it gets through the second set of capillaries really slowly, much too slowly to keep you alive. Your metabolic rate is way too high for this kind of a system to work. But also, as the fish is moving its body, that swimming motion is also giving an assist to the heart and helping to keep the blood moving through. So this is a low pressure system. Like I say, it wouldn't work on an animal with a high metabolic rate like a bird or a mammal. All right, amphibians are interesting because amphibians are kind of transitional animals. They've got that aquatic larva, and then they metamorphose, or at least most of them will metamorphose into terrestrial adults. There are a few exceptions to that, some of the salmon. Transitional animals, they've got that aquatic larva, and then they metamorphose, or at least most of them will metamorphose into terrestrial adults. There are a few exceptions to that. Some of the salamanders remain in their aquatic form throughout their lives, but for the most part, they metamorphose into a terrestrial adult. And amphibians also have a transitional circulatory system. So if you look at this system, you notice that this is not a two-chambered heart. This is a three-chambered heart. You've got two atria, a left one and a right one, and then one large ventricle. And so blood that's coming back, remember, wherever you see systemic, that means the body. So this blood here, these are the capillaries in the frog's body. And so the oxygen gets used up, the blood turns blue. Now we're heading back to the heart, and we head back and enter the right atrium. We pass a one-way valve, an AV valve here, atrioventricular valve, and we go into this big common ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, that forces blood out of the heart, and actually most of that blood is going to stay towards the right. Remember, this is the frog's right, not your right as you're facing the picture. And it'll leave through this pulmonary artery, which sends the blood out to the lungs. And of course, in a lot of amphibians, remember, they're also doing at least some of their breathing through their skin, and there are a few that do all their breathing with their skin. So these are capillaries that are in the lungs and in the skin. And that's where that blood gets oxygenated, so it turns back to red. And now we're in a vein heading back to the heart, except this time we're heading back to the left atrium. We're on the left side of the heart. We pass the left AV valve, going to the left side of this big ventricle, and then when the ventricle contracts, most of this blood is going to stay left and go out to the body. So, when you look at this, you would think that, well, this is horribly inefficient, because all you're doing is taking deoxygenated blood and mixing it, one-to-one with nice fresh blood that's just come back from the lungs. It actually doesn't mix as much as you would think it would. You don't have a very good intuitive feel for the way fluids are flowing through these kinds of chambers, and the way that the heart of amphibians has been designed by natural selection, it keeps those two bloodstreams relatively separate. They do mix some, but it keeps them more separate than you would think. So it is mostly oxygenated blood that leaves the heart and goes out to the body, and it's mostly deoxygenated blood that leaves the heart and heads out towards the lungs. Now, this is a much higher pressure system than you just saw in the fish, because think about it. As when blood leaves the heart, you just got a big pump from the ventricle. It goes through one set of capillaries. Where does it go? Back to the heart. It gets pumped again. Leaves the heart, goes through another set of capillaries, then back to the heart. So with a system like this, the blood is only going through one set of capillaries before it's going back to the heart and getting pumped again, so it keeps the pressure much higher. Reptiles are really interesting. And remember, when we say reptiles, that isn't really a very good taxon in terms of phylogeny of that group, because you've got a few things that are in there that are not that closely related to other reptiles, things like the archosaurs, which are the only survivors of the crocodilians, and the birds. And so the crocodilians are thrown in with reptiles and birds are not. So there's a few weird things there. But anyway, most reptiles, not the crocodilians, have a three-chambered heart. And you might think, well, okay, that's the same as an amphibian heart. It's not. It is the same picture that you're looking at here, but the heart itself is actually not the same. You have this common ventricle. However, in an amphibian heart, it really is just a common ventricle. In a reptile heart, there's actually a partial muscle wall right there that partially divides it, and it separates the flow of oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood more than what you'd see in an amphibian heart. And that partial muscle wall is actually an adaptation, and given the way that the metabolism of most reptiles works, this is actually a better system than having a full-on separated ventricle and having a four-chambered heart the way birds and mammals do. So with that partial muscle wall, reptiles can actually change the shape of the muscle. They can move it, and that means they can divert more flow to the lungs or more flow out to the body. When your heart beats, the same amount of blood goes to your lungs as goes out to your body with every heartbeat. With a reptile heart, it's variable. You can change that ratio, or the reptile can change that ratio. And that means that you can divert blood flow away from the pulmonary circuit and into the systemic circuit. And remember, the systemic circuit is out to the body. The pulmonary circuit is to the lungs. Now, again, you might think that sounds pretty bad, right? Because now you're basically starting to bypass the lungs, at least partially bypass the lungs. And it would be bad for you, because you have a really high metabolic rate. You're using oxygen like crazy, and you have to be breathing constantly. A lot of reptiles, because their metabolic rate is so low, they only ventilate their lungs intermittently. They can sit there for a long time and not pull air into their lungs. It's just sitting there, and then eventually they kind of remember to do it, and they do it. That is not going to work with a mammal. So being able to divert blood from the pulmonary circuit out and send it out to the body is actually an adaptation. One of the things that it allows them to do is increase the flow out to the body when they're warming up in the morning. So imagine a lizard crawls out when the sun comes up, gets on a rock in the sun, and its metabolic rate is really low, even for a lizard, because it's cold. It just spent the night underneath a rock, hiding underneath a rock. And so now the sun is hitting it. It doesn't need every bit of oxygen it can possibly get. So what it does instead is divert most of its blood flow just out to the body, so that it's basically getting warmed up by the sun and then circulating throughout its body. So it helps the animal warm up faster than it would otherwise be able to do. Also, one of the ways that reptiles can stabilize the oxygen concentration in their blood is by matching the pattern of blood flow to the lungs with the oxygen concentration in the blood. So when reptiles when their oxygen concentration is getting low, they'll divert more blood flow to their lungs. When it's high enough, they don't just keep sending all that blood to the lungs, they shunt it over to the systemic circuit and send it out towards the body. Also, for reptiles that are swimmers, primarily, ones that need to hold their breath sometimes, they can reduce the blood flow to the lungs when they're holding their breath, and that allows them to actually harvest more of the oxygen that's in their lungs while they're holding their breath than they would otherwise be able to do. So there's some real adaptations, there's some real advantages, I should say, that come with being able to control what proportion of the blood is going to the body versus the lungs. All right, now we get to the race car circulatory system here. If you have a race car metabolism, this is the kind of circulatory system you need to have. So mammals and birds have it, and of course they're both endotherms, but remember, birds are also archosaurs, and so birds have a four-chambered heart like mammals do. Crocodiles also have a four-chambered heart like mammals do, and so you're kind of looking at two ends of the archosaur spectrum, right? Crocodiles still retain a lot of very primitive characteristics. They are probably not that far removed evolutionarily from the earliest archosaurs, and birds, of course, have picked up all kinds of crazy adaptations for their being able to fly and for other aspects of their lifestyle. So the fact that you've got representatives on both sides of that archosaur spectrum that both have four-chambered hearts indicates that probably all the archosaurs had four-chambered hearts. Hearts don't tend to fossilize well, so we're not certain about that, but they probably all had four-chambered hearts. That's where the good money is betting. Now, this is a double circuit circulation. So a four-chambered heart is basically the same as what you saw with an amphibian heart, except that the ventricle is completely divided into two separate halves. And so really what you have is not a single pump, it's a double pump. they're two separate pumps. Now, they are physically connected to each other, and of course, when your heart beats, both of those pumps are contracting at the same time. But in terms of the blood flow, they are entirely separate. And if you look at this, again, we've got blood coming back from the body, oxygen gets used up, comes back into the right side of the heart, the right atrium, past the right AV valve, into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it passes another one-way valve. These are called semilunar valves. Passes the right semilunar valve, or the pulmonary semilunar valve, heads out the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary trunk artery, out to the lungs, picks up oxygen, heads back to the heart, except it heads back to the other side of the heart, the left side, left atrium, left AV valve, left ventricle, and then the left semilunar valve, and then out to the body. So it's a completely separate circulation, the left and the right side of the heart. Now, this is a high-pressure system, obviously. It's also very efficient at sending really oxygenated blood out to the body because there's absolutely no mixing because the heart's entirely separated. The disadvantage, of course, is that if you ever needed to change the proportion of blood going to the lungs versus the proportion going to the body, you can't change it. It's always going to be the same with this kind of a system. So here you can see the different circulatory systems you find in vertebrates side by side. The only one that's missing is the reptilian system. So remember, it's similar to the amphibian system, except there is a partial muscle wall that partially separates the two ventricles. But anyway, there you go.